Today, we're going to explore the history of the Muppets, but maybe not in the way you're expecting. See, this is their story, but told through the eyes of one particular fan, whose life was kind of shaped by these characters. It's a journey that starts in a family's living room and, well, ends up taking over the world.
And this quote, man, it just hits the nail on the head for so many of us. The Muppets feel like this universal part of growing up, don't they? Kind of like a first love in the world of pop culture. And it's that deep connection that makes the story of their creator, Jim Henson, so incredibly cool. You know, for so many of us, they were our first friends, our first teachers, and definitely our first big laughs. But behind all that felt, and the googly eyes, is the story of a one-of-a-kind creative genius. When you hear the name Jim Henson, your mind probably jumps straight to Kermit the Frog, or maybe Big Bird, or even David Bowie in Labyrinth, right? But the story of this creative genius, well, it starts way before The Muppet Show, in a place you'd probably never guess. So let's pull back that curtain and really dig into the surprising early days of this absolute icon.
Our story doesn't start in Hollywood. Nope, it starts in Washington, D.C., with a teenager who had this wild idea for a local TV station. And this is really where the magic first sparked to life.
The show was called Sam and Friends. And get this, it was just a 5-minute live show. 5 minutes, tucked away on local TV. Now, what's so wild about this is just how small it all was at the start. It was all being created by a kid who was still a teenager. It was this super humble, almost experimental beginning for what would eventually become a global phenomenon. But it was on that tiny little program that the world got its very first look at a character who would become an absolute icon. And this is where it gets really fun. Check out the evolution of an icon. The original Kermit from Sam and Friends, well, he wasn't even a frog yet. He was more of a creature. He didn't have that signature pointy collar, but look close. Those classic split ping pong ball eyes, oh yeah, they were there from day one. I love this detail. It just perfectly sums up the humble, do-it-yourself creativity that was at the absolute heart of Henson's work from day one. He wasn't working with some huge budget, he was just working with huge ideas.
In a living room in Washington, D.C., way back in the 1950s, this is where the magic really began for our author's family. They were just completely captivated by this quirky little local puppet show called Sam and Friends.
So that little 5-minute local show, it started making waves. Big ones. It ended up being the launching pad that took Jim Henson and his little felt creations from a single station in D.C. to TV screens all across America. And you can see his whole game plan laid out right here. I mean, Henson's strategy was just brilliant. He starts with that local show, which builds enough buzz to get him these amazing guest spots on huge variety shows like Ed Sullivan. Then, he pivots to making these super popular commercials, and all that momentum builds up and finally lands one of his Muppets a regular national gig.
And here's a great little piece of trivia for you. Before Kermit was a household name, the very first Muppet TV star was actually Rolf the dog. Seriously, back in the 1960s, he was a permanent sidekick on The Jimmy Dean Show, and audiences absolutely loved him week after week.
So by the mid-60s, Jim Henson is already a successful puppeteer and a known TV personality. But here's the thing. If you think of him as only a puppeteer, you're missing a huge part of his story and his artistic vision. So was that all he was? The guy with the puppets? The answer is a hard no, not even close. Because at the exact same time all this Muppet stuff was taking off, he was pouring his heart and soul into a deeply personal project that had nothing, and I mean nothing, to do with felt and ping pong balls. In 1965, Henson made a short film called Timepiece. And when I say he made it, I mean he did everything. He wrote it, directed it, produced it, and he even starred in it. This was not a Muppet movie. This was pure, unfiltered, experimental Jim Henson. And the film is, in a word, surreal. It's just this cascade of bizarre, disconnected images. It's all meant to capture the chaotic feeling of a modern man's life. It's a trip. And on top of that, it is incredibly fast-paced. The editing is so rhythmic and frantic, it creates this relentless energy that just drags you through this guy's very normal, but also incredibly frustrating day. And get this, there's almost no dialogue in the entire film. In fact, the only spoken word in the whole thing is Jim Henson himself, who just keeps popping up on screen and yelling, "Help," over and over. So what did people think of this strange, experimental art film? Well, in 1966, it was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Short Film. Yeah, This wasn't just some little side project. This was a serious, critically acclaimed piece of art.
Okay, so what on earth was this Oscar-nominated film actually about? What was Jim Henson trying to say? Well, the title itself, Timepiece, is a pretty massive clue.
You know, when you really analyze the film, these themes just scream at you. It's about this guy desperately trying to escape the ticking clock. But a lot of people see it as something more, a direct reflection of Henson's own personality. This frantic energy, this urgent, almost desperate need to create and innovate.
This quote just sums it up perfectly. It's like Timepiece is a little window into the mind of a genius. It really suggests that Henson felt this incredible pressure, this deep awareness that his time was limited, and there was just so much he wanted to get done. It completely reframes his work, right? It wasn't just a job, it was a mission against the clock.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thought to chew on. Knowing about this intense, experimental side of Jim Henson, this Oscar-nominated filmmaker who felt like he was racing against time, does that change how you see the joy and the silliness of the Muppets? For me, it just makes you appreciate the incredible, complex mind that created it all. All right, everyone, we're taking a trip down a very, very famous street to explore a show that didn't just entertain generations of kids, it completely changed television forever.
I bet you just heard that little tune in your head, didn't you? It's a song that promised this friendly, amazing world was waiting for us right through our TV screens. So let's dive in and see how they made that promise come true.
In the 1970s, there was no bigger success in children's television than the absolute phenomenon known as Sesame Street.
Back in 1969, Jim Henson's Muppets were right at the heart of launching a show that wasn't just a hit, it was a full-blown cultural moment. Seriously, Sesame Street completely changed the game for kids' TV. So the mission was incredibly clear and, frankly, super ambitious. They wanted to use all the tricks of commercial television. You know, the catchy jingles, the funny sketches, the characters you just can't forget, to teach kids really fundamental skills. The goal was to make a show so fun, so engaging, that it could reach kids everywhere, especially kids who didn't have access to preschool, all through the power of public broadcasting. And this wasn't just another TV show. It was this incredible collaboration. You had the Children's Television Workshop bringing all the educational research, and they teamed up with the absolute master of puppetry, Jim Henson, and his core team like Frank Oz and Richard Hunt. It was this perfect marriage of education and magic. And what they created, it was so much more than a set. It was a world, a really vibrant, diverse neighborhood that felt both totally fantastical and at the same time completely real to millions of children. It was a place where, monsters and people just lived right next door to each other.
At the very heart of it all was this unforgettable cast of Muppets. The soul of the street, really, was Big Bird, this endlessly curious, super kind-hearted, 8-foot-tall canary who was always 6 years old, just like a lot of the kids watching at home.
And then you had the folks living in the basement apartment at 123 Sesame Street, the all-time classic odd couple. You had the super playful, free-spirited Ernie and his very serious, paperclip-loving best friend Bert. And together, they taught us everything about friendship and, well, opposites.
Of course, there was the lovable grump in his trash can, Oscar the Grouch, who kind of showed us all that it's okay to have a bad day. And how could you forget the monster with his bottomless appetite for cookies, who, believe it or not, was cleverly teaching us all about letters, especially the letter C.
And the cast was just filled with these amazing characters. You had the hilariously helpful Grover, that furry blue monster who tried his absolute best at every single job. And then there was the Count, the vampire who was obsessed with numbers and made counting this delightfully spooky thing to do.
Now, this is really important. The Muppets were grounded in reality by this amazing cast of human characters. They were the guides, the patient teachers, and the friends. They were the grown-ups on the street, and they modeled what kindness and understanding looked like for the Muppets and for all of us watching at home.
The structure of the show itself was just pure genius. So each episode would have a main story happening on the street that was teaching some kind of social or emotional lesson. But then woven all through that were these fast-paced, standalone segments. This whole format was based on research that showed these short, attention-grabbing bits, kind of like commercials, could be super effective for teaching things like letters and numbers over and over in the most entertaining way possible. And, oh my gosh, those segments became iconic. Do you remember Kermit the Frog as a reporter in a trench coat, interviewing fairy tale characters?
Or what about that hypnotic pinball machine song by the Pointer Sisters that counted to 12? These were just these brilliant little nuggets of education. And sometimes you'd get a cameo from someone like the Fonz, which, for a kid watching, was just mind-blowing.
But here's the thing about Sesame Street. It never, ever shied away from the fact that learning isn't just about ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. It's also about figuring out how to navigate life's biggest and sometimes most difficult challenges.
So in 1983, a real-life tragedy hit the show. The actor Will Lee, who played the absolutely beloved store owner Mr. Hooper, passed away. And the producers, they had a really difficult choice to make. And what they decided to do was a landmark moment for children's television.
Instead of just saying, Mr. Hooper moved away, they chose to address his death head-on. In this just beautifully written scene, the human cast explained to Big Bird and to every single kid watching what death means. It was such a powerful moment, and it gently and honestly taught an entire generation about loss, about grief, and about how your friends and neighbors help you through it.
The show also knew when it was time to evolve its storytelling. Okay, so for years, Mr. Snuffleupagus was Big Bird's imaginary friend that no adult ever seemed to see. But then the producers had this realization, we might be sending a really harmful message here, that grown-ups won't believe kids when they tell the truth. So in 1985, they finally had everyone meet Snuffy, which sent this powerful new message: children deserve to be heard and they deserve to be believed.
Pretty quickly, the show's influence just exploded. It went way beyond the television screen and became this essential part of what it meant to be a kid.
You know how a lot of kids' shows back then were basically just 30-minute toy commercials? Well, Sesame Street completely flipped that on its head. It was a nonprofit, so all the money they made from selling books or toys went right back into funding the show's educational, commercial-free mission. The products weren't the point. They were the engine that kept the whole thing running.
And these products, they became such treasured parts of our lives, right? Whether it was the monster at the end of this book, or a talking Big Bird doll, or that Fisher-Price playset that lets you make up your own stories on the street. These items were like little extensions of the learning and the joy the show brought into our homes every single day.
Of course, a world this big and beloved couldn't be contained in just a daily TV show. Its reach expanded into primetime TV specials, like the really ambitious Big Bird in China, and even a full-length movie, Follow That Bird, which took our favorite characters on this huge cross-country adventure.
Okay, so let's fast forward. Decades later, the media world is, well, it's almost unrecognizable from what it was in 1969. And yet, through all of those massive changes, Sesame Street has found a way to adapt and to endure. The show's recent journey really reflects the huge shifts in how we all watch TV now. A move to premium cable and streaming with partners like HBO and now Netflix, well, it makes sure the show can keep its amazing production quality even if the way we watch it looks totally different than it did for the first 45 years.
And all of this leaves us with a final thought. You know, in today's world of a million channels, streaming services, and personalized algorithms, that original idea of one single show that could reach and teach an entire generation of kids, it almost seems quaint. But as Sesame Street continues to evolve, its core mission to make every child smarter, stronger, and kinder, well, that feels more important now than it ever has.
All right, so we all know the Muppets, right? Global icons. But what if I told you their biggest, most legendary success story was actually born from a massive, and I mean massive, public failure? A failure that almost nobody remembers. Well, that's the story we're getting into today.
So let me ask you this. Think about it. What in the world do the Muppets, Kermit, Miss Piggy, the whole gang, what do they have in common with a show like Saturday Night Live? I mean, one's for the whole family, the other not so much.
Believe it or not, the answer is a legendary failure. Yep, a total creative train wreck that, and this is the crazy part, turned out to be the best thing that could have possibly happened to Jim Henson. Okay, to really get this, we gotta rewind the clock. Back to the early 70s. Sesame Street had just exploded, right? It was this massive, massive hit. And you'd think that's a good thing. But for Jim Henson, it actually created this weird problem. He was stuck in a creative trap of his own making. There was this huge disconnect. See, the public, they saw Sesame Street and they were like, oh, cute, the Muppets are for preschoolers. But that wasn't Henson's vision at all. I mean, not even close. He passionately believed that his characters could be entertainment for everybody, for adults, for teens, for the whole family. His biggest success was basically pigeonholing him, and he was desperate to get out.
And look, he really tried to break that mold. He made all these primetime specials, Hey Cinderella, The Frog Prince, a bunch of them. And they were great, super charming, perfect for families. But they were still seen as kids' stuff. He just couldn't shake that label. The needle just wasn't moving.
But then, 1975 rolls around, and this new opportunity pops up. A totally new kind of show. It's experimental, it's edgy, it's very much for adults. It was going to be called Saturday Night Live. And for Jim Henson, this looked like it. This was the golden ticket, the perfect way to show everyone what he'd been talking about. Okay, but here's the catch. The creator, Lorne Michaels, he didn't really call up Henson because he shared his grand artistic vision. Nah. See, the NBC execs were freaking out. They thought this new live show was way, way too scandalous. So Lorne needed something to calm them down. He needed a safe, inoffensive segment to balance out all the edgy stuff. And what's more wholesome and inoffensive than the Muppets, right? So Henson goes for it. He takes this huge swing. They ask him for a recurring sketch, but here's the thing. No Kermit, no Fozzie, none of the characters we know. He created a whole new universe called the Land of Gorch. And these puppets were different, kind of grotesque, dark, and definitely aimed at adults. For Henson, ma'am, this was everything. This was his shot.
And that dream opportunity, yeah, it turned into an absolute nightmare. Like, almost immediately.
It was a disaster from the get-go, for a bunch of reasons. First off, the SNL writers and the cast, they hated it. People like John Belushi were pretty open about it, feeling like these puppets were eating up valuable airtime. The vibe was basically, why is the Sesame Street guy here? And then, to make it all worse, because of union rules, Henson's team couldn't even write their own material. The SNL writers had to do it, and they didn't get it. They didn't understand the Muppet humor at all. And nothing, I mean nothing, sums up the problem better than this quote from the head writer of SNL, Michael O'Donoghue. He just flat out said, "I don't write for felt." Oof, felt. That one word tells you everything, doesn't it? It shows the complete contempt they had. They weren't characters to them, they were just felt. And you could see this backstage drama spilling onto the screen. The sketches themselves got all weird and meta. They basically became jokes about how the Muppets didn't belong on the show and how nobody wanted them there. I mean, can you imagine how awkward that was to watch? It wasn't funny. So yeah, the whole SNL experiment was a total, undeniable failure. But, and this is the most important part of the whole story, this failure was actually a lesson in disguise. It taught Jim Henson precisely what he needed to do to finally succeed. So what did he learn? Well, 3 huge things. Lesson 1, he needed total creative control, period. No more letting other people write for his characters. Lesson 2, the Muppets couldn't just be a 5-minute bit in somebody else's show. They needed their own world, their own format. And lesson 3, maybe the most important one, the real magic happens when the Muppets get to play with actual human beings, the guest stars. So now he's got this blueprint for success, right? Forged in the fires of failure. And he doesn't waste any time. He goes right out and starts building the show he always wanted to make. And this, my friends, is how The Muppet Show was born. He puts together 2 pilot episodes to pitch his big idea. The first was The Muppets Valentine Show. The second, and you gotta love this title, was called The Muppet Show Sex and Violence. He was really trying to send a message, this isn't just for kids. These were his sales pitch for a brand new weekly series. He's got the pilots, he's got the vision, he's got the passion. He takes it to all the big American TV networks, and every single one of them said no. Can you believe that? They just couldn't see it. They were still stuck on the whole Sesame Street guy thing. It felt like it was over before it even began. But then a call comes from overseas, from England. A British production company called ITC had seen the pilots, and they got it. They totally got it. They made him an offer. If you're willing to pack up and move production to the UK, we'll fund your show. And you know what he did? He said yes. And just like that, in 1976, The Muppet Show hit the airwaves. And here's the genius part. It was made in England and then sold back to TV stations in the US through syndication. He basically did an end run around all the networks that had turned him down.
And the show wasn't just a hit. It was a phenomenon, a global sensation. It was everything he wanted it to be. It was smart, it was hilarious, it had so much heart, it had A-list celebrities lining up to be on it, and best of all, kids loved it, and adults loved it too. He finally did it. And it was all because he failed so spectacularly at SNL. So in the end, the road to one of the most beloved shows of all time was literally paved by the wreckage of that Land of Gorch disaster. It's just an amazing reminder, that sometimes our biggest wins come directly from our biggest failures. It kind of makes you think, right? What amazing success is just waiting for you, right on the other side of a failure you haven't had yet? We're going to take a trip back, a journey to this really magical moment in pop culture history, a time when a bunch of felt and foam creatures, well, they truly ruled the world. So, let me just start with a question. If you had to guess, what was the biggest, most watched show on the entire planet back in the late 70s? The answer, it might not be what you think. It was this chaotic, super charming, and just completely brilliant variety show, hosted by a frog. That's right, we are talking about The Muppet Show. And look, this was so much more than a kid's program. It was a full-blown cultural phenomenon that became this magnet for an incredible, and I mean incredibly diverse range of talent. I mean, the sheer variety of guests was just astounding. You had rock gods like Elton John and Alice Cooper, comedy legends like Steve Martin and John Cleese, even opera singers like Beverly Sills. For the older stars, it was a way to connect with a whole new generation. For the up-and-coming stars, it was a launchpad. And for the ones at the absolute peak of their fame, it was simply the coolest stage on television. It just had this perfect mix of real sincerity and pure, beautiful chaos that made everyone want to come and play. So, as the Muppets became this huge global thing, it also created this really powerful personal connection for our author. His mom, who loved that original DC show, passed that passion right down to him. Their family ritual? Recording every single episode of The Muppet Show on their Betamax, and of course, watching those tapes until they were practically worn out. For kids watching at home, the show was basically a weekly masterclass in pop culture. One week you'd have Superman and Wonder Woman, Christopher Reeve and Linda Carter, and the very next you'd be watching entertainers that his grandmother absolutely adored. It was one of those rare shows that really did bridge the generation gap. But of all the amazing classic episodes, there's one that just stands out. It was this singular, universe-colliding event on television, the time when the biggest show on Earth met the biggest movie franchise in the entire galaxy. So get this. In February of 1980, Jim Henson and George Lucas pulled off this incredible casting coup. They got Mark Hamill, Anthony Daniels, and Peter Mayhew to appear on the show in character as Luke, C-3PO, and Chewie. And the episode aired once before The Empire Strikes Back even came out, giving audiences their very first sneak peek at Luke Skywalker's new Bespin outfit. It was literally an exclusive preview hidden inside a variety show. How cool is that? And this episode, it succeeded where that infamous Star Wars holiday special had just, failed so spectacularly. It was proof that you could do a Star Wars-themed variety show the right way. It was charming, it was funny, and maybe most importantly, it knew not to overstay its welcome. It was only 30 minutes long. The episode ended with the whole cast, Muppets and Star Wars characters, singing When You Wish Upon a Star. And in the background, this hybrid space fortress and Disney-esque castle rises up. As our source points out, it was this surprisingly prophetic image, sort of foreshadowing the giant entertainment empire that would one day own both of these beloved franchises. Kind of eerie, right? The Muppet Show was a global phenomenon. It was smart, it was chaotic, it was hilarious, and it was full of heart. It was everything he had been fighting to create for years. It was entertainment that wasn't for kids or for adults. It was just for people. And once that typecast was finally broken, he was free. He could create masterful, beautiful specials like Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas, a project with such incredible artistry and emotional depth. He could finally show the world the full range of what he could do. So, with television completely conquered, Jim Henson started looking at an even bigger stage. It was time. Time for the Muppets to make that ambitious leap from the small screen to the silver screen. When the Muppet movie came out in 1979, it was just a revelation. You have to remember, this was a world with no CGI. All the effects were practical, and they were so seamless that even legendary critics like Siskel and Ebert admitted they were just completely befuddled. They had no idea how Henson did it. I mean, how did they make Kermit ride a bicycle? It was just pure, unadulterated movie magic.
Well, for the author, who was only 4 years old at the time, those practical effects felt a little too real. There's this one scene where Animal swallows some growth pills and becomes enormous. To pull that off, the crew built this massive, 2-story tall animal puppet operated by a crane. Now, imagine seeing that on a 40-foot screen as a little kid. Yeah, it was terrifyingly real. But here's the thing. He loved the movie so much, he kept going back to see it again and again. So he developed a system. Right before the scary part, he'd get up, leave the theater, and ask an usher to give him the all-clear sign. Then he'd come back to his seat. The theater staff actually got to know him and became part of this weekly ritual. Now that is dedication. Now, the success of the movie wasn't just some isolated thing. Nope, it was the centerpiece of this single, explosive year, where the Muppets weren't just popular, they were absolutely everywhere. The year was 1979, and it was, without a doubt, the absolute peak of Muppet mania. The sheer volume of high-quality stuff they put out in just 1 year is honestly staggering to think about. Okay, so in a single year, they release a massive hit movie. They have a primetime TV special celebrating that movie. And then, in a move that was just unheard of, Kermit the Frog guest hosted the entire 90-minute Tonight Show. And to top it all off, they released A Christmas Together with John Denver, which is still a timeless holiday classic. It was a complete takeover of the entire entertainment landscape, all of it driven by one singular creative vision. And just to bring our author's story full circle, a few years later, he recorded the Muppet movie on his Betamax. Watching it on that little TV screen, the giant animal just wasn't scary anymore. He said that finally watching that scene without being afraid was this wonderful feeling of achievement, a personal victory, all thanks to home video. But, like with all golden ages, this incredible run on television, well, it had to come to an end. And for the fans, it was a truly bittersweet moment. In 1981, a new special called The Muppets Go to the Movies aired. It was this fun tribute to classic cinema and also a promo for their second film. But it was something more. It quietly served as the final episode of The Muppet Show. Jim Henson was just ready to move on to other projects. The special and the series ended with the entire cast singing this really poignant song, We'll Meet Again. It felt like they were making a promise to the audience that even though the show was over, this wasn't really goodbye. And you know what? They kept that promise. The end of the show just marked the beginning of a new era, one focused on movies and specials. The Great Muppet Caper came on 81, followed by more beloved TV events. The Muppets weren't gone. They were just evolving. Looking back at all of this, it kind of leaves you with one big question. What was it? What was the secret ingredient that made this specific Muppet era so uniquely magical? Was it the sincerity, the groundbreaking creativity, that perfect blend of chaos and heart? Maybe the secret ingredient was just Jim Henson himself, a visionary who proved that a little bit of felt could hold a whole lot of soul.
We're diving into the incredibly creative and honestly pretty experimental 1980s of Jim Henson and the Muppets. And we're going to see it all through a fan's personal journey, based on the writings of Carlo DiSalvo. We'll see just how far Henson's world stretched during a decade of absolutely massive expansion.
So let's start with the feeling. You know the one. That simple act of recording a beloved show. For the author of our source material, this was a constant challenge. Because in the 80s, Jim Henson was giving fans so much to love, it was practically a race to try and save it all on these worn-out Betamax tapes.
Because after the massive global phenomenon of The Muppet Show ended its run, you might think Jim Henson and his team would take a break, right? Nope, not even for a second. Instead, they just exploded outward, pouring all that creative energy into brand new TV shows, ambitious experimental films, and a whole slate of unforgettable specials. So, with The Muppet Show's run officially over, Henson's creativity had to find new homes on TV. This led to two very different but equally beloved series that really came to define the decade for a whole new generation of fans.
And these two new shows, man, they could not have been more different. On one hand, you had Fraggle Rock, this amazing live-action puppet show, but it was on the premium channel HBO, and that created a huge source of frustration for fans like our author, who lived in areas that just didn't have cable yet. The show was right there, but just out of reach. And this quote just nails that feeling, right? That feeling of being on the outside looking in. The author could only catch these little glimpses of the show when he was visiting relatives, which of course only made him want to see more of this mysterious new world Henson had created.
Okay, so on the flip side, over on mainstream Saturday morning TV, something kind of strange was happening. An animated version of The Muppets. Now, on paper, that sounds a little weird. But for our author, any of that initial skepticism about Muppet Babies completely vanished after watching just the first episode.
And wow, did it work. Muppet Babies became this massive hit with both kids and adults. The writing was just fantastic, packed with all these clever pop culture references. And the whole idea, using the babies' imaginations to launch into new adventures, it just perfectly captured the chaotic, heartfelt spirit of the original characters.
Okay, so let's shift gears from the small screen to the big screen. Because Henson's ambition wasn't limited to television, he also wanted to push the boundaries of filmmaking with some incredibly risky and really creative movies.
Yeah, the 80s were a busy time for Henson's company at the movies. And the projects ranged from the familiar, like fun romps with the classic Muppet Gang, to entirely new, dark, and pretty complex fantasy worlds.
One of those films, of course, was the big screen debut for the Sesame Street crew in Follow That Bird. Now, Henson didn't direct this one, but his company produced it, and he was right there, hands-on, performing Kermit and Ernie. Our author actually missed it in theaters, but made sure to catch it later on a Betamax rental. But really, the most experimental, the most out-there films of the era were, without a doubt, The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. Both kind of followed a similar path. They didn't do great at the box office at first, but their incredible artistry and unforgettable characters, including, of course, David Bowie's Goblin King, have since earned them this cherished, devoted cult status.
But, for our author and honestly for a lot of fans back then, there was a real distinction. These ambitious fantasies were appreciated for their craft, for sure, but they just didn't quite capture that same heartwarming magic as the original Muppet movie.
All right, we have to talk about something absolutely crucial to this whole era. You just can't discuss this period of creativity without talking about Jim Henson's most important partner, the one and only Frank Oz.
So, what in the world connects Miss Piggy, Yoda, and the movie Little Shop of Horrors? I mean, think about it. The connection between these three completely different pop culture icons really shows the incredible range of one performer and director, someone who was central to so many projects both inside and outside the Henson universe.
Well, the answer is, of course, Frank Oz. His impact was just immense. He wasn't just the performer behind Miss Piggy and Fozzie. At Henson's recommendation, he also became the original voice and puppeteer for Yoda. And then he stepped into the director's chair, co-directing The Dark Crystal, and then flying solo with The Muppets Take Manhattan, which launched his own incredible directing career. So all of this, all these new shows, these ambitious movies, it was all building towards a kind of grand finale, a whole universe of TV specials that started bringing all these expanding worlds together. Yeah, throughout the 80s, the Muppets were just all over primetime. They reunited with John Denver for Rocky Mountain Holiday, and they starred in some truly bizarre experiments, like the fantastic Miss Piggy show, which featured a very, very confusing appearance by Andy Kaufman's abrasive alter ego Tony Clifton. But for our author, this was also a time of, well, technological change at home. The family's old Betamax was finally wearing out, and a new VHS VCR hadn't replaced it yet. This meant some classic moments were watched live, but sadly, not recorded for posterity. A small detail that would soon lead to a pretty big regret.
Because in 1987, something amazing happened. What our author calls the greatest Muppet special ever made. A Muppet Family Christmas wasn't just a holiday special, it was this huge, incredible crossover event that united nearly every single Henson property on screen together for the first time. The Muppets, the Sesame Street Gang, the Fraggles, even the Muppet Babies showed up in puppet form.
And yeah, this was the one he didn't record. It's that feeling of missed opportunity that I think we can all relate to. That instant regret of knowing you've just witnessed something truly unique and special, and just wishing you could have saved it forever.
This whole journey, this incredible explosion of Jim Henson's universe, it was all preserved by fans on these worn-out Betamax tapes and in their cherished memories. It was a fleeting, magical time. Which leaves us with a final thought. What's that one moment, that one show or special that you wish you still had on an old tape?
Jim Henson. I mean, just hearing the name brings this whole universe of characters to mind, right? But today, we're not just taking a trip down memory lane. We're going to focus on the final, incredibly busy years of his life, a time of just wild ambition, crazy innovation, and a burst of creativity that was really setting the stage for what was supposed to come next. So let's dive into this amazing final chapter.
You know, hindsight can be a really powerful and honestly a pretty heartbreaking thing. This quote, it really frames everything we're about to talk about. Because at the absolute peak of his company's success, the future for Jim Henson just seemed wide open, full of endless promise. And that's exactly what makes looking back at this specific time so bittersweet.
All right, so let's set the scene. The year is 1989. After spending years making these incredible, groundbreaking films like The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, Jim Henson decides it's time to bring the Muppets back to where it all began, primetime TV. And he did it with a brand new, super ambitious series for NBC.
And listen, this was not just going to be another Muppet show, no way. The whole concept was an anthology, a showcase. It was designed to be this weekly window into the entire universe of Jim Henson's imagination. So one week you'd get hilarious comedy, and the next maybe a really deep, fantastic fairy tale. It was a huge creative risk. For the Muppet parts of the show, he totally switched up the premise. That classic, charmingly chaotic backstage theater? Gone. Instead, he created Muppet Television, where Kermit and the whole gang were now in charge of running their very own TV network.
And what was really cool was the tech they were using. The main set was this sleek, futuristic control room. But get this, it was almost entirely a virtual set, created with green screen technology, which was pretty cutting edge for TV back then. They even introduced a new character, Digit, who was a cyborg, just to lean into that high-tech vibe. And of course, all while bringing back the classic characters we all know and love.
Okay, so the most important thing to understand about this show was its structure. Most weeks, it wasn't just one story. The hour was literally split into two completely different parts that honestly felt like they came from different creative universes. And you can really see that split here. On one side, you had Muppet Television with all the familiar comedy and craziness. But on the other side, you had The Storyteller, which was a totally different beast. This was a cinematic, often dark and dramatic fairy tale series that starred the incredible John Hurt. It was like getting a primetime comedy and a prestige fantasy film all in 1 hour.
And while the show as a whole kind of struggled to find its identity with audiences, The Storyteller was the part that critics just raved about. They saw it as a masterpiece. As our source author puts it, they were just highly enjoyable. I mean, they were these beautifully crafted little films that totally stood on their own.
But here's the thing. Despite all that incredible artistry and ambition, especially in parts like The Storyteller, the Jim Henson Hour, just didn't click with a big audience. Maybe the format was too confusing, who knows? But it really struggled in the ratings.
Henson's team poured so much work into the show, producing 12 complete, incredibly detailed episodes.
But, and this had to be just a crushing blow for everyone involved, NBC only ever aired 9 of them. They just pulled the plug before the whole series even got a chance to be seen.
So you see a big, high-profile show get canceled like that, and you have to ask, right? Was this a sign that the magic was starting to fade? Was the Jim Henson Company actually in trouble?
Not even close. And this is where the story gets so fascinating. Because while that TV show was struggling, behind the scenes, Henson's company, and especially his creature shop, was having one of its most successful years ever.
1990 was an absolute blockbuster year for them. On TV, the Muppets proved they were still huge with a hit special at Walt Disney World. But the real game changer was happening in the movie theaters. Henson's Creature Shop took on what seemed like an impossible job, bringing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to life for a live-action movie. And they absolutely nailed it. I'm not exaggerating when I say the success of that entire blockbuster movie rested on whether you believed those turtle suits were real. The work was groundbreaking, the movie became this huge cultural phenomenon, and it just cemented the Creature Shop as the undisputed best in the world at what they do.
So you've got this incredible dynamic going on, right? A passion project gets canceled, but the company is more successful and more creatively alive than ever. The Muppets are still beloved, the Creature Shop is an industry powerhouse, and there are even merger talks happening with Disney.
They were truly, truly at the top of their game. It really felt like the start of a whole new chapter. What kind of worlds were they going to build next? What new characters would they bring to life? The potential just seemed infinite. And then, everything changed.
In May of 1990, at just 53 years old, Jim Henson died suddenly from a bacterial infection. Just like that, the creative engine was gone. He left behind this incredible legacy, and that heartbreaking question of what other wonders he still had left to share with us all.
Imagine for a second having to say goodbye to your creator, but using the very voice he gave you. That was the absolutely impossible task the Muppets faced back in 1990. So today, we're going to talk about how they celebrated and mourned the incredible man who brought them to life, Jim Henson. You know, this sentence is so simple and stark, and that's because that's exactly how the news felt in May of 1990. For millions of us who grew up with the Muppets, it wasn't just sad news, it was this unbelievable shock. It felt like a creative force of nature had just been extinguished.
And this quote, I think it just says it all. It captures that raw, personal shock perfectly. For so many people, this wasn't like losing some distant celebrity. It really felt like losing a part of your own family. The architect of this entire world of joy and chaos and real wisdom was suddenly and just incomprehensibly gone.
Okay, so to really get why the tribute that followed was so powerful, we first have to understand just how huge this loss was. It wasn't just sudden, it was a shockwave. It left this global community of creative people just reeling, not just for who Jim Henson was, but for all the magic he still had left to create.
And what makes it even more tragic is how preventable it all seemed. Jim Henson just thought he had a bad cold that wouldn't go away. But the man was a workhorse, always pushing himself to the limit on his projects. He put off going to the doctor until it was just too late. By the time he was finally hospitalized, it had turned into a severe bacterial pneumonia, and his body just couldn't fight it off. And get this, he was only 54 years old. Just 54! I mean, he was at the absolute height of his creative powers, with so many more ideas and projects he wanted to bring to life. The sheer untimeliness of it all just made the shock and the sadness that much worse.
So how do you even begin to pay tribute to a man like Jim Henson? His collaborators, his friends, they were facing this almost impossible challenge, using his own creations, the Muppets, to honor the man who was, for all intents and purposes, their very soul.
So just a few months after he passed away, this special aired, and its whole premise was incredibly clever. Instead of just being a simple clip show, it actually had a story, a kind of meta-narrative where the Muppets themselves are scrambling to put on a show to celebrate Jim.
And the setup is just key. Kermit is understandably absent, so all the responsibility falls on Fozzie Bear to organize the whole tribute. Choosing Fozzie was such a deliberate, poignant move. He's always that well-meaning second-in-command, trying so hard to please Kermit. So putting this impossible weight on his shoulders made the whole group's grief and confusion feel incredibly real. And it all leads to this devastating moment where the characters read real letters of condolence from fans, and it's through these letters that they learn, on screen, that Jim is gone.
So Fozzie's anxiety, that becomes the emotional heart of the entire show. He's totally overwhelmed, doubting that anything he can do could possibly be good enough to honor Jim. And this perfectly mirrored the real feelings of the performers left behind. I mean, how could anything they create ever feel adequate enough to celebrate their friend and their mentor?
And it's right from this moment of Fozzie's crisis that the special's most profound and moving sequence comes to life, and it's all built around a single, really powerful song. The song's called Just One Person, and what's interesting is, it wasn't even a Muppet song originally. It's from Snoopy the Musical, but it was a song that Jim personally loved, one that really spoke to his own philosophy about how one single person can make a huge difference.
Okay, this is where the special becomes just incredibly deep. See, years earlier on The Muppet Show, the guest star Bernadette Peters sang this very song to a tiny, sad Robin the Frog who felt like he was too small to matter. Well, now, in the tribute, it's Robin who starts singing that same song to a distraught Fozzie. It is a perfect, beautiful callback, showing that the lesson wasn't forgotten, it was passed on. And as the other Muppets join Robin in singing, one by one, the whole performance is transformed. It's not just a tribute to Jim anymore. It becomes a way for them, as a community, to hold each other up through their shared grief. We are literally watching art become a form of healing, right there on screen.
But as the special started to wrap up, there was one massive question hanging in the air. A question that was completely tied up with Jim Henson himself.
Yeah, what about Kermit the Frog? For decades, Jim Henson was Kermit. His voice, his little head tilts, his gentle spirit, they were one and the same. Could the Muppets really go on without their leader? Could Kermit even exist without Jim? And then, in the final moments, he does. Kermit the Frog walks on screen to talk to Fozzie. And I think the entire world held its breath in that moment.
This was it. This was the moment everyone was waiting for and probably dreading a little bit. It was the first time anyone would hear Kermit speak without Jim Henson's voice. A torch was being passed right in front of us.
And oh man, it was a deeply bittersweet moment. The voice was, as one fan put it, close, but not quite right. You could feel Jim's absence. And yet, there was Kermit. He was there to reassure Fozzie, to tell him he did a great job, and then he closed the show just like he always did, bringing back that sense of familiar comfort and closure.
That brief appearance, it sent such a powerful message of hope. It was a promise, really. A promise that even with Jim gone, his spirit, his characters, and his legacy of joy, they would all endure. Kermit lived on, and so would the Muppets.
And you know, this whole theme of community, of using performance and song to get through grief and find hope, that wasn't just for the cameras. It was a direct reflection of what was happening in real life.
At Jim Henson's real-life memorial service, the line between performance and reality just completely dissolved. It felt less like a somber funeral and more like this vibrant celebration, and it was structured exactly how he would have wanted it. The Muppet performers were there, not just as themselves, but with their characters. Big Bird was there. The Muppets spoke and they sang. And what did the entire service end with? The whole congregation, all these amazing artists and creators, singing a medley of Jim's favorite songs, and ending, of course, with just one person, the very same song that gave the tribute special its heart. And that's why this tribute, and Jim's work in general, still has such a lasting power. It taught us that it's okay to be sad, but it's absolutely essential to come together. Songs like The Rainbow Connection aren't just sweet little songs for kids. They are profound statements about hope and belief and why connecting with each other matters so much. Ultimately, the story of the Muppets Celebrate Jim Henson is so much more than just television history. It's this powerful testament to how art can guide us through our darkest moments, how it gives voice to our sadness, brings us together, and reminds us that even after profound loss, the show can and absolutely must go on.
So let's talk about something. What happens when a true creative genius, someone like Jim Henson, is suddenly gone? What happens to the world they created? That's what we're digging into today, that first crucial decade for the Muppets after their creator. We're talking immense pressure, huge creative gambles, and really a fight for survival. I mean, that's the big question, right? It's just incredibly high stakes. Imagine being Jim Henson's family, his collaborators. You're left wondering, can Kermit and Gonzo and Miss Piggy, can they even exist anymore? Can they still matter without the very person who gave them a soul? So you can just imagine the scene in the early 90s. There's this cloud of uncertainty hanging over everything. The Jim Henson Company is now being run by his kids, and they've got this almost impossible job, you know? They have to honor this incredible legacy, but at the same time, prove it's not just a museum piece, that it has a future. And yeah, their first huge test was coming up fast. And that test, it was a movie, a big one, The Muppet Christmas Carol, which came out in 1992. This was the first major project of this whole new era. You can't even imagine the pressure. And guess who was directing? Jim's own son, Brian Henson. Talk about stepping into some giant shoes. So how did they pull it off? How did they succeed when the odds were so stacked against them? Well, The Muppet Christmas Carol wasn't just a movie. Not at all. It was a statement, a declaration, really. It was them saying the Muppets can and will continue. And its success? Honestly, it was everything. It was pivotal for the franchise to even survive. And their strategy was just so smart. Instead of trying to create a whole new universe from scratch, which would have been so risky, they did something brilliant. They decided to adapt a stone-cold classic. By using Dickens' story, they already had this amazing foundation to build on. Then they layered on these wonderful new songs, that classic Muppet warmth, and, well, that last piece of the puzzle, a really powerful lead human actor, that turned out to be the secret weapon. And this quote, it just nails the film's impact, which went way beyond just ticket sales.
You have to remember, for the fans, for people who grew up with these characters, seeing them on screen again, in a story with so much heart, it was comforting. It was like a healing balm. It felt like a promise that, okay, the magic isn't gone.
Okay, so let's zoom in on that secret weapon I mentioned, Michael Caine. His performance as Scrooge wasn't just good, it completely changed the game for how a Muppet movie could work. And it all started with one very specific, very unusual request he made. He told them he wanted to play it straight. What does that mean? It means no winks to the camera, no fourth wall breaks. He wasn't going to act like he was surrounded by a bunch of fuzzy puppets. No, he was going to act as if he were performing Shakespeare on a London stage. And what that did, wow, it created this amazing contrast. You have the Muppets being their usual chaotic, hilarious selves, but Scrooge's story, his journey, felt completely real and emotionally grounded.
It was just a masterstroke, seriously. That single decision lifted up the whole movie. It gave the Muppets this incredible, serious, dramatic anchor to bounce off of. And it proved that the Muppet formula wasn't stuck in the past. It could evolve, it could find new layers, new depth.
But you know how it goes. After a huge high like Christmas Carol, the rest of the 90s, well, it was a bit more of a roller coaster. It really became a time of trial and error, of experimentation. Some things landed, and some things not so much. And you can see this uneven path really clearly in the big projects that followed. In '96, they went back to the classic book idea with Muppet Treasure Island. Then, in the late 90s, they tried to get back on TV with Muppets Tonight. And finally, in '99, they went in a totally different direction, trying a more modern sci-fi thing with Muppets from Space. And the author's own experience with these films really shows you how inconsistent things were. For him, one movie was a total bust in the theater, just a frustrating trip. But then the other one, he caught on TV and really enjoyed it. It's a perfect snapshot of how people were reacting to these new directions. It was all over the map. But here's the interesting thing. Even in a movie that he didn't personally love, there were still these amazing high points. He notes that pretty much everyone agrees Tim Curry's performance in Treasure Island is fantastic. And that just drives home that Michael Caine lesson, right? A great human lead can be a huge, huge asset, even if the movie itself gets a mixed reaction. Now, trying to get back to their roots on TV, that was tough. Muppets Tonight really struggled. The whole TV world was changing, and it just couldn't find its audience. It only lasted 2 seasons, the ratings weren't great. I mean, trying to recapture the magic of the original Muppet Show for a whole new generation in the 90s, that turned out to be an incredibly tall order. So, when you look back at this whole decade, with big highs like Christmas Carol and, definite lows like the TV show, what's the takeaway? Was it a failure? No, absolutely not. You just have to change how you define success for them during this specific time. Look, the goal was never going to be matching the pure singular genius of the Jim Henson years. That's just impossible. The real mission of the 90s was about something else entirely, something way more fundamental. It was about proving that the Muppets could last, that they could endure beyond their creator. It all comes back to that question we asked at the very beginning. Can this thing survive? The entire decade, really, was one long stress test on the characters, the world, and all the ideas Jim Henson put into motion. And the answer? It was a resounding yes. Through all the hits and all the misses, they proved it. They proved that the Muppets were bigger than any one person, even their brilliant creator. They proved the legacy was strong enough to endure. And that was the real triumph of the 1990s. So as we wrap this up, it kind of leaves you with this bigger idea, doesn't it? The Muppets' whole journey through the 90s is this amazing case study. It suggests that for any piece of art to really outlive its artist, it needs a few things: a rock-solid foundation, a team that's willing to adapt, and a new generation that's ready to pick up that torch and carry it forward. What does it really take for art to become immortal? It's definitely something to think about.
Welcome to The Explainer. So, what happens when a beloved creation, something truly special, loses its creator? Today, we're going to explore the incredible journey of the Muppets after the passing of the one and only Jim Henson, and we'll do it through the eyes of a lifelong fan.
And this quote right here, man, it just nails it. It really sets the stage for everything we're going to talk about. It's not about projects being good or bad, It's about that specific, intangible magic. This one sentence just perfectly captures the huge challenge of the post-Henson era. How in the world do you keep that kind of lightning in a bottle?
So when Jim Henson passed away way too soon back in 1990, he left behind this incredible creative empire. I mean, he redefined what puppetry could be, but his absence left this giant void and this huge question mark hanging over everything. The very heart of the Muppets was gone, and really, nobody knew if it could ever beat the same way again.
Okay, so the early 2000s. This was a super crucial period, you know? A lot of trial and error for the company, which was still run by Henson's family. And this era, it really showed both the amazing promise and the real danger of trying to continue this legacy without its original visionary.
And what you saw during this time was this wild contrast in quality. I mean, on one side, you had gems like the Christmas movie and that awesome Weezer music video. They felt right. They captured that classic mix of sincerity and humor. But then, on the other hand, you had a bunch of direct-to-video things that just left a lot of fans feeling like something was seriously missing. That magic was, just like our source said, pretty sporadic.
So what was the secret sauce in those high points? What made them work? Well, according to our source, it all came down to one thing: getting back to their roots, to the theater. For a fan who grew up on the original Muppet Show, seeing Kermit and the gang back in that chaotic, charming, iconic theater for the first time since 1981, wow, that wasn't just a creative decision. It was a deeply emotional homecoming. It was magic.
So even with those powerful moments like returning to the theater, that overall inconsistency, that search for a steady hand, it all led to a major turning point, a huge deal with Disney. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is, this wasn't some new idea. It was actually a conversation that Jim Henson himself had started years before he passed.
And this is the absolute key to understanding this whole thing. That 2004 sale, it wasn't some sudden corporate takeover. It was really the completion of a vision Henson himself had for these characters he loved so much. He was getting tired of running a company, you know? He just wanted to get back to what he did best, creating. And this deal was meant to free him up to do that. His family, ultimately, just honored that wish.
And this breakdown shows you just how specific the deal was. So Disney got the main Muppets franchise, Kermit, Piggy, Fozzie, the whole gang, plus Bear and the Big Blue House. But, and this is super important, the Henson family kept control of their creative studio, the Jim Henson Company. And the Sesame Street characters, they went to their longtime nonprofit home where they belonged.
So, problem solved, right? Disney's in charge now. But here's the thing. Just because you own the world's most famous frog doesn't mean you automatically get the magic back. The Disney era has been its own roller coaster of hits and misses, pretty much continuing that same pattern of sporadic success.
But if you look closely at that mixed bag, a really clear formula for success starts to pop out. The magic seems to come roaring back when the people in charge aren't just suits, but are genuine lifelong fans, creators who grew up with the Muppets and just get their unique blend of heart, chaos, and smart humor on a gut level. And you can see this fan-driven formula in action perfectly with a couple of the big successes. That 2011 movie, which was a total passion project for Jason Segel, was just a giant love letter to the original show. And at the same time, you had these viral YouTube videos like that incredible Bohemian Rhapsody cover that proved the characters could feel totally fresh and modern and still be perfectly 100% Muppet.
But then you flip the coin and you get the 2015 ABC series. For so many fans, this whole project just felt like a major misstep. It tried to be edgy and modern with this kind of cynical tone that felt more corporate than creative. It just lost that core of joyful vaudevillian chaos that makes the Muppets who they are. So after all these highs and lows, what's the big takeaway? Well, it really seems that for the Muppets, every success and every failure always comes back to one thing: how closely it connects to the brilliant, singular vision of the man who started it all. And this, right here, is why it all matters so much to so many people. This final quote just says everything, doesn't it? For millions of us, the Muppets aren't just characters or some piece of intellectual property. They're a really formative, deeply personal, almost sacred part of who we are. They taught us about friendship, about being creative, and about finding joy in the middle of all the chaos.
Which leaves us with this one last really fascinating question that applies to any great artistic legacy, right? What's the secret to keeping that magic alive? Is it about perfectly honoring the past, protecting it at all costs, or is it about being brave enough to reinvent it for the future? For the Muppets, it seems like the search for that magical balance is still going.